Welcome to the world of Oakhaven, where tonight we explore the Black Death and a village's fight for survival. Now settle in, get comfortable, let your shoulders relax, maybe tuck your feet up if that feels right. Take a nice, slow breath. Find that cozy spot where you can just drift. I wonder where you are listening from tonight. Are you nestled in a quiet corner, or perhaps braving the late evening, or maybe even an early morning in your perfectly chaotic schedule? Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here with me. If this journey into history sparks something in you, consider subscribing so you don't miss another tale from the past. It's the year of our Lord 1348. And I, Alara, a humble herbalist from the bustling port of Bristol, find myself arriving at the doorstep of Oakhaven. The stories have reached even our busy docks, whispers of a strange new illness, a sickness unlike any seen before, and my mission is to understand it, to perhaps find a way to heal it. But as I step into this remote village, the unsettling truth about this invisible enemy and the desperate struggle ahead is only just beginning to reveal itself. The scent of salt and tar, once a comforting reminder of home, faded behind me as the carriage rumbled away from Bristol. My satchel, packed with dried herbs and my grandfather's well-worn medical texts, felt reassuringly heavy against my hip. News of a strange sickness, a creeping ailment that moved with unnerving speed, had reached the port city. Whispers spoke of a swift and terrible affliction, and my purpose was clear. Journey to the isolated village of Oakhaven, document this new illness, and, if possible, find a remedy. This task felt like a natural extension of my work, tending to fevers and coughs in Bristol's crowded alleys. The journey itself offered a stark contrast. The usual lively bustle of the city giving way to quiet country lanes and open fields. Even the distant cries of gulls were soon replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves overhead, a peaceful sound that nevertheless felt unusual for this time of year, as the road remained surprisingly empty. As I first approached Oakhaven, the village seemed remarkably untouched by the disquiet that had propelled me from the city. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the comforting smell of baking bread mingled with the earthy scent of damp soil, evidence of a recent shower that had left the air fresh. Children's laughter echoed near the village well, a bright counterpoint to the low hum of daily life. I introduced myself to the village elder, a man whose hands were deeply weathered, a testament to a life spent working the land. His gaze, however, was sharp with suspicion. He spoke of the coughing sickness that had claimed a few villagers recently, his words clipped and wary as he regarded my city attire and my probing questions. Yet I noted his eyes often returned to the pouch of herbs I carried, perhaps seeing a potential in my wares that his mistrust kept him from admitting openly. The taste of the fresh spring water from the well was clean and cool, a welcome change from the sometimes brackish water of Bristol. My initial days were occupied with the familiar work of tending to minor ailments, a child's persistent fever, a farmer's unfortunate sprained ankle. However, a growing disquiet began to settle upon me as I observed subtle yet unsettling signs of change. Several cottages that should have been abuzz with morning chores remained shuttered, their windows dark and still. The usual rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer was notably absent from the soundscape of the village. A chilling quiet had started to creep into spaces that had only days before been filled with the sounds of daily life, creating a strange emptiness. I passed a small cottage where an elderly woman typically sold plump red apples. The door was ajar, and I heard only the mournful creak of the wood in the passing breeze, a sound that seemed to underscore the deepening silence. The faint smell of wood smoke still lingered, but it was now accompanied by something else, a subtle, unpleasant odor that I couldn't quite identify, causing me to pause and consider its origin. My attention turned from these general observations to a more urgent concern when a young boy, no older than 10 years, was brought to me. His small body burned with fever, his breathing was ragged and strained, and dark, angry swellings had begun to appear beneath his arms and in the folds of his groin. The raw fear mirrored in his mother's eyes was a chilling reflection of my own dawning apprehension. This was not the simple fever I knew from my studies. It was something far more virulent. My hands moved with practiced speed as I administered a strong infusion of willow bark to ease his pain and applied a poultice of crushed comfrey, hoping to reduce the painful swellings, though my heart pounded with a new kind of urgency. I recalled my grandfather's steadfast advice: "Observe, Alara, the body speaks its own language." But this illness was speaking in a dialect I had never encountered, and the potential consequences of my limited understanding felt immediate and profoundly daunting. The taste of the bitter herbs I crushed for his drink was almost as overwhelming as the fear that tightened my chest. Word of the boy's worsening condition spread like wildfire through the hushed lanes of Oakhaven, igniting a new wave of anxiety. The village elder, his face deeply etched with worry and a flicker of something akin to anger, confronted me directly. He voiced a belief that my presence had somehow invited this sickness, or that my newfangled methods were interfering with the natural course of things, perhaps even provoking divine displeasure. He spoke of ancient rituals and fervent prayers, and I felt the heavy weight of his distrust pressing down on me, making my own confidence waver. Were my remedies truly useless against this unseen enemy? The rough texture of the wool tunic I wore suddenly felt scratchy against my skin, a physical manifestation of my growing unease and the isolation I felt among these fearful people. It was a stark reminder of how easily fear could turn suspicion into blame, and I found myself questioning my own judgment. Amidst the prevailing unease and the elders' open distrust, I found an unexpected ally in a farmer named Thomas. He had tragically lost his wife to the sickness the week before my arrival, and his grief had not curdled into suspicion, but had instead settled into a grim, quiet practicality. He seemed to understand the profound need for action, however uncertain the outcome, recognizing the suffering that surrounded them. Thomas readily helped me gather more herbs from the surrounding fields, his intimate knowledge of the local flora proving invaluable. He also shared his keen observations, how the sickness seemed to strike entire families with frightening rapidity, and how it spread so quickly through close contact between individuals. He spoke of a peculiar, unpleasant smell that clung to those afflicted by the disease, a sharp, almost foul odor that no amount of washing seemed to entirely remove. Working alongside him, the faint scent of turned earth clinging to his hands provided a grounding, steady presence amidst the growing chaos. The sickness, once a distant rumor, now gripped Oakhaven with an unrelenting force, its shadow deepening with each passing day. The young boy I had treated, despite my earnest efforts, ultimately succumbed to the illness. Witnessing his small, still body sent a profound wave of despair through me, a feeling I struggled to contain. More cottages fell silent, their doors shuttered, and the familiar, lively village chatter was increasingly replaced by the mournful sounds of weeping. The communal burial ground, usually a quiet, solemn place, became a site of constant, somber activity. The dull, rhythmic thud of shovels on earth serving as a grim soundtrack to our lives. I began to notice a faint metallic tang on my tongue, an odd sensation I initially dismissed, but which I later came to associate with the pervasive sense of fear that had settled over the village. My initial academic curiosity had been thoroughly overshadowed by a desperate, almost primal need to understand this illness and, more importantly, to save lives. Father Michael, the village priest, found himself wrestling openly with his faith, his voice often trembling with doubt. He witnessed the dying, the prayers that seemed to go unanswered, and the pervasive suffering that defied any theological explanation he could offer. He sought me out, not for cures, but for understanding, for any small glimmer of hope I might possess in my scientific endeavors. We spoke for hours within the quiet confines of his sparsely furnished study, the air filled with the comforting scent of old paper and beeswax, a familiar aroma that usually brought solace, but now seemed imbued with a profound sorrow. He confessed his own deep bewilderment at the nature of this plague, asking, "Where is God in this, Ilara?" his voice thick with an unbearable sadness. His struggle was a stark mirror to my own professional crisis. My carefully prepared remedies, my meticulously catalogued herbs, were they all utterly meaningless against this invisible, relentless force? Amidst the pervasive atmosphere of death and despair, I discovered a surprising flicker of resilient life in a young orphan girl named Lily. Her parents had been among the very first to be taken by the sickness. She clung to me, her small hand holding mine with a strength that belied her size. I took her in, sharing my meager provisions and offering what protection I could. Her innocent, often unanswerable questions and her desperate need for comfort served as a powerful, essential reminder of the purpose that had brought me here. Teaching her to grind herbs, to fetch water from the well, to simply follow instructions became a vital, grounding part of my daily routine. Her presence, the simple feel of her small, warm hand in mine, was a potent balm against the immense emotional fatigue I felt accumulating with each passing day. The simple taste of dried dates we shared for sustenance became a small, sweet moment of normalcy, a brief respite from the overwhelming hardship. The sickness continued its relentless march through the village, its hold tightening with each passing day. I began to experiment more boldly, combining herbs known for their fever-reducing properties with others believed to possess blood-cleansing qualities, my actions driven by a growing desperation. I insisted on burning juniper branches in the homes of the afflicted, hoping to purge the unhealthy air, and urged the villagers to boil their water, a practice met with initial grumbling, but eventually gaining grudging acceptance. I began to see the effectiveness of isolation firsthand when a small cluster of cases started to abate only after I convinced a particular family to remain strictly confined within their cottage, separating them from the wider community. It was agonizing work, the sharp scent of burning herbs filling my small infirmary, a desperate attempt to ward off the inevitable, and my own body ached with exhaustion, each breath feeling like a laborious effort under the constant strain. A traveling merchant, desperate to pass through Oakhaven on his way north, found himself forced to stop when his cart suffered a significant breakdown. He brought with him tales of similar sicknesses appearing in other villages along his route, confirming my growing fears that this was not an isolated event confined to Oakhaven. He spoke of physicians in larger towns who had unceremoniously fled their patients, leaving them to their fate. He also mentioned a theory that was circulating in the South, suggesting that the plague was carried by tiny creatures invisible to the naked eye, a concept that sounded like madness, but resonated with the way the sickness seemed to leap from person to person with uncanny speed. His words, though unsettling, provided a new, albeit disturbing, angle for my observations. The rough weave of his cloak brushed against me as he spoke, a fleeting but tangible connection to the outside world and its own struggles. Thomas, my steadfast farmer ally, was taken ill. His strength, his quiet pragmatism, his ability to bear sorrow with a stoic grace, all were extinguished by the relentless march of the disease. I sat by his bedside, administering what comfort I could, but my remedies offered no cure, only a slight lessening of his suffering in his final hours. His passing was a profound and devastating blow, a personal failure that struck me deeply. I had come to rely on his quiet, dependable strength, and his death felt like a significant loss. The silence that followed his last labored breaths was more profound than any I had yet experienced in the village, an emptiness that seemed to swallow all sound. The memory of his gruff voice, the comforting smell of earth and honest labor that always clung to him, felt like a physical ache within me. I found myself wrestling with the powerful urge to flee, to abandon this dying village and seek my own safety, the choice between my duty and my self-preservation gnawing at me relentlessly. With the plague showing no signs of abating its devastating progress, my focus gradually shifted from the elusive search for a cure to the more immediate task of providing comfort and alleviating the suffering of the afflicted. I learned to manage the intense pain with tinctures of poppy, to carefully clean and dress the dreadful wounds that appeared, and to offer soothing drinks and words of hope, even when the outlook remained grim and unforgiving. I taught Lily how to prepare simple herbal teas and how to keep the sick comfortable, ensuring their basic needs were met. The acrid scent of sickness had become familiar, but I also learned to recognize the subtle, calming scents of chamomile and mint that I used to ease fevers. My confidence was no longer rooted in conquering the disease, but rather in easing its passage, in holding on to what little remained of our shared humanity amidst the widespread devastation. The weight of all that I had witnessed and experienced settled upon me, tempering my youthful eagerness with a deep, quiet resolve that felt more substantial than any outward success. The sickness eventually receded, leaving behind a village profoundly scarred by the immense loss it had endured. Oakhaven was undeniably quieter now, many homes standing empty, their former inhabitants gone forever. The communal burial ground stood as a stark, silent monument to the many who had fallen. I had not found a miracle cure, no simple answer to this devastating plague that had swept through the land. But I had learned a great deal. I had observed, I had experimented, and I had, in my own small way, offered solace and comfort to those who needed it most. My understanding of healing had deepened immeasurably, encompassing not only the body, but also the spirit, and the fragile, enduring human spirit. The taste of salt on my lips as I prepared to leave was not solely from the sea air. It was also the tang of tears shed in sorrow, of battles fought and lost, but also of a hard-won, undeniable survival. The road back to Bristol would be a very different journey, marked by the echoes of Oakhaven and the lessons learned in its quiet, mournful heart. The scent of salt and tar had long since faded, replaced by the earthy aroma of damp soil, and the faint, sweet smell of wood smoke as I finally approached Oakhaven. My satchel, containing dried herbs gathered with care, and my grandfather's worn texts on healing, felt like a familiar weight against my shoulder. Word of a peculiar sickness, a swift and terrible ailment, had reached Bristol, carried on the winds and whispered in the crowded taverns. My purpose was to document its spread, to understand its nature, and, if possible, to find a way to combat it, much like I had learned to do with the fevers and coughs that plagued the city's less fortunate quarters. The journey had led me from the bustling, often noisy streets of the port city into quieter country lanes and open fields, the distant cries of gulls slowly giving way to the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Even the road itself seemed quieter than I expected for this time of year, a stillness that held a subtle, unacknowledged tension. Upon my arrival, Oakhaven presented an image of peaceful existence, seemingly untouched by the concerns that had driven me from Bristol. Smoke curled invitingly from stone chimneys, and the comforting smell of baking bread mingled with the fresh scent of damp earth left behind by a recent shower. Children, their laughter a bright, clear sound, played near the village well, their youthful exuberance a cheerful counterpoint to the low, steady hum of daily life. I sought out the village elder, a man whose weathered hands and stern gaze immediately conveyed a deep sense of authority. He regarded me with a suspicion that was palpable, his responses to my introduction clipped and guarded. He spoke with evident weariness of the coughing sickness, a malady that, he admitted, had claimed a handful of villagers in the preceding weeks. His weariness of my city ways and my persistent questions was evident, yet I observed a subtle shift in his expression, a fleeting look of interest when his gaze fell upon the satchel of herbs I carried. The taste of fresh spring water drawn from the village well was clean and wonderfully cool, a welcome change from the occasionally brackish water I had grown accustomed to in Bristol. My initial days in Oakhaven were occupied with the usual range of ailments: a child's persistent fever, a farmer's unfortunate sprained ankle that required a poultice of comfrey. However, as I moved through the village, I began to notice unsettling patterns that did not fit the usual rhythm of country life. Several cottages that should have been alive with the morning bustle of chores remained resolutely shuttered, their windows dark and uninviting. The steady, rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, a sound that usually echoed through the village square, was conspicuously absent. A chilling quiet had begun to settle over areas that had been vibrant with activity only a few days before. I found myself pausing before a small cottage where a woman traditionally sold ripe apples. The door stood slightly ajar, and a gentle creak of the wood in the passing breeze was the only sound I could discern. Though the faint smell of wood smoke still lingered, a subtle, unpleasant odor, one I couldn't quite identify, was beginning to overlay it, causing me to pause and consider its source. My focus shifted with a desperate urgency when a young boy, no older than 10 years, was brought to me, his small body racked with fever. His breathing was ragged, shallow gasps that tore at his chest, and dark, angry swellings had begun to appear beneath his arms and in the folds of his groin. The sheer terror in his mother's eyes mirrored the growing apprehension within me. This was not the familiar fever I knew, not a simple imbalance of humors that could be coaxed back into order. My hands moved with a practiced, if trembling, speed as I administered a strong infusion of willow bark to ease his pain and applied a poultice of crushed comfrey, hoping to reduce the alarming swellings. I could recall my grandfather's steady voice in my mind. "Observe, Ilara. The body speaks its own language." But this illness, I realized with a sinking heart, was speaking in a dialect I had never encountered, and the potential consequences of my ignorance felt immediate and profoundly heavy. The taste of the bitter herbs I crushed for the boy's drink seemed to amplify the fear that tightened its grip on my chest. As word of the young boy's worsening condition spread through the village, the elder confronted me, his face a mask of worry, etched with a deep, almost palpable anger. He voiced his belief that my very presence might have invited this sickness, or perhaps that my newfangled methods were interfering with a natural or even divine course of events. He spoke fervently of ancient rituals and the power of prayer, and I felt the full weight of his distrust bearing down on me. I attempted to explain my understanding of bodily humors and the importance of maintaining balance, but my words seemed to vanish into the fearful silence, falling on deaf ears. My own confidence, already fragile, began to waver. Was it possible that my carefully prepared remedies were utterly useless against this invisible enemy? The rough texture of the wool tunic I wore suddenly felt scratchy and uncomfortable against my skin, a physical manifestation of my growing unease and the friction between my knowledge and their deeply held beliefs. Amidst the escalating unease and suspicion, I found an unexpected ally in a farmer named Thomas. His wife had succumbed to the sickness the week before my arrival, a loss that had clearly left him grief-stricken but not consumed by despair. Unlike the elder, his profound grief had not hardened into distrust, but had instead settled into a grim, determined practicality. He saw the suffering but touched every corner of Oakhaven and understood the urgent need for action, even if the path forward was shrouded in uncertainty. He offered his assistance, helping me gather more herbs from the surrounding fields, his intimate knowledge of the local flora proving invaluable. Moreover, he shared his own keen observations, how the sickness seemed to strike entire families, how it spread with alarming speed through close contact between individuals. He spoke, too, of the unpleasant smell that clung to those afflicted, a sharp, almost foul odor that no amount of washing seemed to dispel. Working alongside him, the faint, grounding scent of turned earth clinging to his hands provided a welcome contrast to the pervasive fear. The sickness was no longer a distant rumor. It had firmly gripped Oakhaven, its hold tightening with each passing day. The young boy I had treated, despite all my efforts, ultimately succumbed to the illness. Witnessing his small body still and lifeless sent a wave of profound despair washing over me. More cottages were shuttered, and the familiar sounds of village chatter were increasingly replaced by the mournful sounds of weeping. The communal burial ground, a place usually marked by quiet contemplation, was becoming a site of constant, somber activity, the dull thud of shovels on earth marking a grim, relentless rhythm. I began to notice a faint metallic tang on my tongue, an odd sensation that I initially dismissed, but soon came to associate with the pervasive fear that settled over the village. My initial academic curiosity had long since evaporated, replaced by a desperate, driving need to understand this ailment and, more importantly, to save lives. Father Michael, the village priest, found himself wrestling openly with his faith in the face of such widespread suffering. He witnessed the dying, the prayers that seemed to go unanswered, and the overwhelming pain that defied any explanation he could offer from his scripture. He sought me out, not for cures, which he knew I could not provide, but for understanding, for any glimmer of hope I might possess in my scientific approach. We spoke for hours within the quiet confines of his sparsely furnished study, the comforting scent of old paper and beeswax filling the small space. He confessed his own profound doubts, his bewilderment at the relentless nature of this plague. "Where is God in this, Ilara?" he asked, his voice thick with unspeakable sorrow. His struggle mirrored my own growing professional crisis. Were my learned remedies, my carefully cataloged herbs, truly meaningless against this invisible force that seemed to mock our efforts? Amidst the pervasive shadow of death that had fallen over Oakhaven, I discovered a small but potent flicker of life in a young orphan girl named Lily. Her parents had been among the first to be taken by the sickness, leaving her utterly alone. She clung to me, her small hand grasping mine with a surprising strength that belied her fragile appearance. I took her in, sharing my meager provisions and finding in her needs a powerful anchor. Her innocent questions, her simple need for comfort and reassurance served as a constant reminder of the reason I had undertaken this journey. Teaching her to grind herbs, to fetch water with a bucket almost as big as she was, to simply follow instructions with quiet diligence became a vital and grounding part of my day. Her presence, the gentle feel of her small, warm hand clasped in mine, was a profound balm against the growing emotional fatigue that threatened to overwhelm me. The simple taste of dried dates we shared for sustenance became a small, sweet moment of normalcy in our disrupted lives. As the sickness continued its relentless march through Oakhaven, I felt compelled to undertake more desperate measures. I began to experiment more boldly, combining herbs known for their fever-reducing properties with others believed to cleanse the blood, seeking any potential synergy. I insisted on burning juniper branches within afflicted homes, a practice intended to purge the unhealthy air, and urged the villagers to boil their water, a practice met with initial grumbling, but eventually with grudging acceptance as the situation worsened. I witnessed the effectiveness of isolation firsthand when a small cluster of cases began to abate after I convinced a family to remain strictly within their cottage, separating them from the rest of the community. It was agonizing work, the sharp scent of burning herbs filling my small infirmary, a desperate attempt to ward off the inevitable. My own body ached with exhaustion, and the constant strain of vigilance made each breath feel like a conscious effort. A traveling merchant, desperate to continue his journey north through Oakhaven, was forced to halt his passage when his cart's axle snapped. He brought with him tales of similar sicknesses afflicting other villages along his route, confirming my growing fear that this was not an isolated outbreak, but a far-reaching affliction. He spoke of physicians in larger towns who had abandoned their patients, fleeing the disease and leaving them to face fate alone. More disturbingly, he mentioned a theory circulating in the southern regions that the plague was carried by tiny creatures unseen by the naked eye, a concept that sounded like madness, but resonated with the way the sickness seemed to leap from person to person with terrifying speed. His words, though unsettling, offered a new, if disturbing, angle for my observations and reinforced the gravity of our situation. The rough weave of his wool cloak brushed against me as he spoke, a brief tactile connection to the world beyond Oakhaven's shadowed lanes. Thomas, my farmer ally, and a man of quiet strength and resilience, was taken ill. His robustness, his pragmatism, his capacity for quiet grief, all were extinguished by the relentless march of the disease. I sat by his bedside, administering what comfort I could through herbal infusions, but my remedies offered no cure, only a slight easing of his suffering in his final hours. His passing was a profound and devastating blow. I had begun to rely on his quiet strength, his unwavering support, and his death felt like a personal failure, a testament to the overwhelming power of the sickness. The silence that followed his last labored breath was more profound and crushing than any I had yet experienced in the village. The memory of his gruff voice, the honest smell of earth and labor that always clung to him, felt like a physical ache in my chest. I found myself wrestling with a powerful urge to flee, to abandon this dying village and seek my own safety. A desperate internal conflict between my duty as a healer and the primal instinct for self-preservation that gnawed at me. With the plague showing no discernible signs of abating, my focus gradually shifted from the elusive search for a cure to the essential task of providing comfort and alleviating suffering wherever possible. I learned to manage the intense pain with tinctures of poppy, to meticulously clean and dress the painful wounds, and to offer soothing drinks and words of hope even when the outlook remained grim. I taught Lily how to prepare simple herbal teas and how to tend to the comfort of the sick, her small hands proving surprisingly capable. The acrid scent of sickness had become a familiar, unwelcome companion, but I also learned to recognize the subtle, calming scents of chamomile and mint used to ease fevers and soothe troubled breaths. My confidence was no longer rooted in the idea of conquering the disease, but in the smaller, more attainable goal of easing its passage, of holding on to what little thread of humanity we could preserve amidst the overwhelming devastation. The weight of all that I had witnessed settled upon me, tempering my youthful eagerness with a deep, quiet resolve. The sickness eventually receded from Oakhaven, leaving behind a village deeply scarred by profound loss. Oakhaven was now a much quieter place, many of its homes standing empty, their inhabitants claimed by the plague. The communal burial ground stood as a stark, somber monument to those who had fallen. I had not found a miraculous cure, no simple answer to this devastating plague that had swept through the land. But I had learned a great deal. I had observed, I had experimented, and I had, in my own small way, offered solace and relief where I could. My understanding of healing had deepened considerably, now encompassing not just the physical body, but also the resilience of the human spirit. The faint taste of salt on my lips as I prepared to leave Oakhaven was not solely from the sea air. It was the tang of tears shed, of battles fought and lost, but also of the enduring spirit of survival. I carried with me not just notes on a terrifying new disease, but the profound, hard-won knowledge of human resilience and the enduring strength of compassion. The road back to Bristol would be a different journey altogether, marked by the silent echoes of Oakhaven. This encounter with widespread sickness and its devastating impact lingered in my thoughts. The quiet of Oakhaven had been a comforting blanket upon my arrival, a welcome contrast to the clamor of Bristol. Now, however, that same quiet felt like a shroud slowly being drawn tighter. The familiar sounds of daily life had begun to recede, replaced by an unnerving stillness. I had spent my initial days tending to simple ailments, a child's fever from a bad chill, a farmer's twisted ankle from a slip on the muddy track leading from his fields. These were the common complaints I was trained to handle, the rhythms of a village I understood. Yet even then, a subtle disquiet had begun to settle. I noticed it first in the cottages, several homes that should have been stirring with morning activity, with the sounds of families beginning their day, remained stubbornly shut. The usual bright chatter was absent, and the comforting smell of baking bread that often wafted from these homes was nowhere to be found. This was not mere laziness, it was a deliberate, unnerving closure. The blacksmith's hammer, usually a reliable beat in the village's heart, was silent, its absence a hollow echo. A chilling quiet, deeper than mere peace, had begun to settle over places that had been vibrant with life only days before. My rounds took me past a small cottage where a woman habitually sold ripe red apples from a basket near her doorway. Today, the door was ajar, just a sliver of darkness revealed within. Curiosity and a growing professional caution led me to peer inside. No sound emerged, save for the soft, rhythmic creak of the door itself as a gentle breeze nudged it further open. The faint, comforting smell of wood smoke still clung to the air from nearby hearths, a familiar and reassuring scent, but it was now overlaid with something else, something subtle and unpleasant. It was an odor I couldn't immediately identify, a faint, almost cloying scent that made me pause and take a shallower breath. This disquiet intensified as I continued my observations. The communal well, usually a hub of activity with villagers drawing water and exchanging pleasantries, saw fewer visitors. Those who did come moved with a strange haste, their faces drawn and their eyes downcast, as if avoiding unseen gazes. I saw a farmer I knew, a usually jovial man with laugh lines around his eyes, hurry past me, his shoulders hunched without even a nod. This pervasive sense of apprehension, this avoidance of open interaction, was more alarming than any specific symptom. It spoke of a fear that was becoming as tangible as any physical ailment. The subtle unpleasantness in the air seemed to grow stronger in certain areas. Near the edge of the village, where a small stream meandered through overgrown reeds, the odor was more pronounced. It was a sharp, almost metallic tang, mingled with something earthy and decaying that made my throat feel tight. I found myself covering my mouth with a corner of my linen coif more often, a gesture that felt both futile and instinctive. My initial understanding of humors and imbalances, the knowledge passed down from my grandfather, seemed insufficient to explain this pervasive sense of wrongness. The usual clean scent of damp earth after the recent shower was now tainted. A particular cottage, known for its cheerful residents and the scent of drying herbs that often wafted from its windows, was now unnervingly dark. Its shutters were latched from the outside, a grim indication of quarantine, a practice I had only heard spoken of in hushed tones during my studies of earlier plagues. This solitary act of shuttering a home spoke volumes about the fear that had taken root in Oakhaven, a fear that was now dictating the very way people lived, or rather, the way they were forced to hide themselves away. It was a stark visual representation of the unseen enemy they faced. My attention was drawn to a small group gathered near the village green, their voices low and urgent. The village elder was speaking, his hands gesturing emphatically. Though I could not make out his exact words, the tone was one of distress and accusation. He was talking about the dwindling number of healthy villagers, the increasing workload on those who remained, and the growing fear that the sickness would eventually claim everyone. He spoke of a failing harvest, not because the crops were bad, but because there were too few hands to bring them in, a chilling testament to the illness's insidious reach into the fabric of their lives. My attention was drawn to a small group gathered near the village green, their voices low and urgent. The village elder was speaking, his hands gesturing emphatically. Though I could not make out his exact words, the tone was one of distress and accusation. He was talking about the dwindling number of healthy villagers, the increasing workload on those who remained, and the growing fear that the sickness would eventually claim everyone. He spoke of a failing harvest, not because the crops were bad, but because there were too few hands to bring them in, a chilling testament to the illness's insidious reach into the fabric of their lives. I found myself drawn to the fields on the outskirts of the village, seeking a different kind of quiet, a place where I could collect my thoughts and perhaps gather more common herbs for general remedies. The rustle of the wind through the tall grasses usually brought a sense of peace, but today it seemed to carry whispers of unease. I noticed that the usual bright calls of the field larks were less frequent, replaced by the occasional jarring cry of a crow. The ground itself, usually firm and dry at this time of year, was surprisingly soft in places, suggesting an unusual dampness that was perhaps contributing to a general malaise. It was here, amidst the quiet fields, that I encountered Thomas, the farmer whose wife I had learned had passed shortly before my arrival. He was mending a section of fence, his movements slow and deliberate. Unlike the general air of fear and avoidance, Thomas possessed a quiet resolve. His grief was evident in the lines etched deeper around his eyes, but it had not broken his spirit. He nodded to me, his expression grave but not fearful. His presence was a solid, grounding force in the midst of growing uncertainty, a reminder that resilience could still be found. He spoke of his wife, not with overt sorrow, but with a quiet remembrance of her strength. He then turned his attention to the state of the village, his words laced with a farmer's pragmatic concern. He pointed out how entire families had been struck down within days of each other, a pattern that suggested more than just simple contagion. He mentioned the foul smell that seemed to cling to the afflicted, a persistent, unpleasant odor that even vigorous washing failed to eliminate, a detail that echoed the faint, strange scent I had detected earlier. His observations, grounded in the harsh realities of rural life, were invaluable. As we spoke, a faint shimmer distorted the air above a distant patch of earth, an unusual visual phenomenon I had never encountered before. It was not the heat haze of a summer day, as the air was cool and carried the scent of damp soil. This distortion seemed to pulse, almost as if something unseen were moving beneath the surface. I pointed it out to Thomas, who squinted at the spot, then shook his head, attributing it to tired eyes. But it was another unsettling detail added to the growing collection of anomalies. My mind, ever the cataloger of the unusual, filed it away, though I could not yet assign it meaning. We then discussed the strange silence that had fallen over Oakhaven, and Thomas offered his own perspective. He believed it was a collective fear, a communal holding of breath, waiting for the next blow. He confessed that many villagers were turning away from the traditional practices, their faith tested by the relentless suffering and the seeming indifference of the heavens. This widespread doubt, this questioning of divine will, was a significant shift. He mentioned that a traveling tinker had recently passed through, speaking of similar silences and fears in villages further to the north, confirming my growing suspicion that this was not an isolated incident, but a spreading dread. My initial mission had been to document a sickness, to find a remedy, but now, standing in the quiet fields with Thomas, I realized the challenge was far greater. It was about understanding the very nature of this affliction, its insidious spread, and its profound impact on the human spirit. My satchel felt heavy, not just with herbs, but with the weight of responsibility. I had come to Oakhaven prepared for fevers and coughs, but this was something else entirely, something that tested the limits of my knowledge and the strength of my resolve. The sweet taste of the wild berries we shared for sustenance was a small comfort against the grim reality. I had witnessed something that would stay with me, a silence that spoke louder than any cries. My focus shifted dramatically when a young boy, no older than 10, was brought to me. He was burning with fever, his breathing ragged, and dark, angry swellings had appeared beneath his arms and in his groin. The fear in his mother's eyes was a mirror to my own growing apprehension, for this was not the simple fever I knew from my city practice, and the consequences of my ignorance felt immediate and profound. I remembered my grandfather's words, a steady anchor in times of uncertainty. Observe, Alara, the body speaks its own language. However, this illness was speaking in a dialect I had never encountered, one that whispered of unknown dangers and immense challenges to my abilities. As the boy lay before me, his skin hot to the touch, I moved with a practiced speed that belied the frantic pounding of my heart. My hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as I reached for my satchel. I administered a strong infusion of willow bark, a common remedy for easing pain and reducing fevers, hoping it would bring some relief from his suffering. Following this, I carefully prepared a poultice of crushed comfrey, a herb known for its healing properties, to try and reduce the painful swellings that had so alarmingly appeared. The taste of the bitter herbs I crushed for his drink was almost as strong as the fear that tightened my chest, a potent reminder of the life hanging precariously in the balance. The farmer, Thomas, who had brought the boy, watched me with a quiet intensity. His wife had succumbed to the sickness only a week prior, and his grief had not made him brittle with suspicion, but rather sharpened his focus on practical needs. He had seen firsthand how quickly life could be extinguished and understood the desperation of a mother watching her child fade. He stood nearby, a silent presence, his own rough hands, still smelling faintly of the earth he worked, offering a strange sort of comfort in their grounded familiarity. His quiet observation underscored the gravity of the moment, and I felt the weight of his unspoken plea for a miracle. This encounter marked a distinct turning point in my time here, pushing my efforts from observation and general care to direct, high-stakes intervention. The previously encountered ailments, though serious in their own right, had not presented such a stark and immediate threat. The dark swellings, a symptom I had only read about in hushed whispers in the city, now lay before me, a physical manifestation of the unknown enemy we faced. My knowledge, honed through years of study and practice, felt suddenly inadequate, like a candle struggling against a gale. Consequently, my focus shifted dramatically from tending to minor coughs and sprains to confronting this terrifying new illness. The boy's labored breathing and the alarming appearance of the buboes, as I later came to understand they were called, confirmed my deepest fears. This was not a sickness I had faced before, and the very real possibility of failing him, of watching another life slip away under my care, was a daunting prospect. The scent of wood smoke that usually drifted pleasantly through the village now seemed tinged with something foreboding, a subtle shift in the familiar aromas. The fear in his mother's eyes was a direct reflection of my own growing apprehension, a shared dread that pulsed between us in the quiet cottage. She clutched a worn wooden rosary, her lips moving in silent prayer, her faith a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness. I knew then that my role extended beyond mere physical remedies. I also had to navigate the currents of fear and hope that swirled around me, trying to offer what little reassurance I could without uttering false promises. The air in the small room felt close, making each breath a conscious effort, a physical manifestation of the tension. I remembered my grandfather's words, a constant refrain in my mind. Observe, Alara, the body speaks its own language. He had taught me the importance of keen observation, of noticing the smallest details that could unlock the mystery of an ailment. However, this illness was speaking in a dialect I had never encountered, using words and phrases that were entirely foreign to my medical vocabulary. The consequences of my ignorance felt immediate and profound, pressing down on me with an almost physical weight, making my own breathing shallow. Therefore, the taste of the bitter herbs I crushed for the boy's drink was almost as strong as the fear that tightened my chest, a potent, unpleasant flavor that lingered on my tongue. It was a taste I would soon become all too familiar with, a constant reminder of the fight I was engaged in. This single encounter had transformed my mission from a task of documentation to one of desperate survival, for the boy, for his mother, and, by extension, for the entire village that unknowingly stood on the precipice. The growing unease that had begun to settle over Oakhaven intensified with this dire development. It was no longer a matter of isolated cases or lingering worries. It was a clear and present danger, demanding my full attention and the very best of my abilities. The subtle shift I had noticed in the village's atmosphere, a quiet resignation replacing earlier peace, now seemed to deepen, as if the very air was growing heavier with unspoken dread. Building on this foundation of concern, my thoughts turned to the broader implications. How had such a virulent illness taken hold so quickly, and what were its initial triggers? While the boy's condition was my immediate focus, the larger pattern of this sickness began to occupy my mind more persistently. The speed with which it seemed to strike and the specific, terrifying symptoms it presented suggested a foe unlike any I had studied in my texts. The smooth stones of the well I had drawn water from earlier that day now seemed less comforting, more alien. Furthermore, the pragmatic farmer, Thomas, shared his own observations with me after I finished tending to the boy. He mentioned that the sickness seemed to affect families more than individuals, often striking down multiple members within a short span. He also noted the unpleasant, sharp odor that clung to the afflicted, a smell that washing did little to dispel. These details, though grim, were vital pieces of information, helping to sketch a fuller picture of this terrifying disease. This information provided a new avenue for my professional inquiries. It wasn't just about treating the immediate symptoms, but understanding the spread and nature of the illness itself. The implications of family-wide outbreaks were chilling, suggesting a highly contagious agent that could easily devastate a close-knit community like Oakhaven. The rough bark of the oak tree under which we spoke felt solid and grounding, a stark contrast to the unseen forces at play. Additionally, his account of the persistent, unpleasant odor associated with the sick offered another sensory detail to record. This indicated that the illness might have a physical component beyond the visible swellings, perhaps a unique bodily response or an external factor that accompanied the contagion. The scent of blooming jasmine, usually so sweet, seemed distant and out of place amidst these grim discussions, a reminder of the world outside this unfolding crisis. My expertise, honed in the crowded streets of Bristol, dealing with common fevers and putrid sores, felt both essential and woefully inadequate. The challenges presented by this sickness demanded more than just poultices and infusions. They required a deeper understanding of its origins and transmission, knowledge I did not yet possess. The weight of this realization settled upon me, making the simple act of breathing feel like a deliberate effort, a testament to the growing strain. Consequently, the weight of responsibility, already heavy, now felt immense. My training had prepared me for many ailments, but this felt different, a force of nature rather than a simple imbalance of humors. The lives of these villagers, whose quiet existence I had briefly become a part of, now rested, in part, on my ability to learn and adapt to a previously unknown enemy. The smooth texture of my worn leather satchel, usually a source of comfort, now felt slick with the sweat of my own exertion and anxiety. Therefore, I found myself wrestling with the limitations of my knowledge, the gnawing fear of inadequacy clashing with the innate drive to heal. The young boy's mother, her face etched with a desperate hope, looked to me for answers, for a reprieve from her mounting terror. Her silent plea was a powerful motivator, urging me to push beyond my current understanding and to seek out any clue that might offer a path forward. My training had led me to this unexpected moment. The boy's condition worsened, a truth I could no longer ignore. His mother's face, once etched with worry, now held a terrifying vacancy as she watched her son struggle for breath. Word of his decline, a dark cloud, had already begun to spread through the village, carried on hushed voices and fearful glances. The elder, a man who clung to tradition like a drowning sailor to driftwood, sought me out near the village well. His normally stoic face was a mask of concern, overlaid with an unmistakable anger directed squarely at me, a stranger with my unfamiliar ways. "This sickness," he declared, his voice a low rumble, "it is not natural. You're coming here, you're poking and prodding. Perhaps you have offended the spirits of this place." His words stung, but I understood the fear that drove them, the desperate need to assign blame when faced with the incomprehensible. I tried to explain my actions, the simple logic of herbs and their properties, the concept of balancing the body's humors. I spoke of the comfrey poultice and the willow bark infusion, trying to convey that my intent was healing, not harm. However, my explanations seemed to evaporate in the face of his deep-seated beliefs, his faith in ancient rituals and fervent prayers. He spoke of the village's traditions, of appeasing unseen forces, and I felt a cold knot of doubt tighten in my stomach. Were my efforts truly futile against this unseen enemy? The rough texture of my wool tunic, usually a comforting barrier against the elements, suddenly felt like a shroud, a physical manifestation of the unease that had begun to seep into my very bones, making my own skin feel like an unwelcome guest. My confidence, which had felt so solid when I left Bristol, began to fray like old rope. I recalled my grandfather's meticulous notes, his unwavering belief in observation and careful treatment. Yet this illness defied his teachings, its swift cruelty leaving me feeling like a novice. He had taught me how to identify different fevers, how to manage a cough, but this was a different beast entirely. His lessons were of little use when faced with the dark swellings, the rapid decline, the sheer hopelessness that settled over the afflicted. I found myself questioning every decision, every herb I had gathered, the weight of responsibility pressing down with each shallow breath the boy took. The knowledge I possessed felt increasingly inadequate, a fragile shield against an overwhelming tide. Amidst this growing unease, I encountered Thomas, a farmer whose quiet resilience offered a stark contrast to the elder's accusatory stance. He had lost his wife to this same sickness just the week before my arrival, and the grief had not driven him to anger, but to a sort of grim, practical acceptance. He saw the suffering around him, the fear etched on every face, and understood the need for action, however uncertain the outcome. He sought me out, not to question my methods, but to offer assistance, his weathered hands calloused from years of working the soil. He readily agreed to help me gather more herbs from the surrounding fields, his intimate knowledge of the local flora proving invaluable. Thomas shared his own observations, sharp and clear despite his personal loss. He spoke of how the sickness seemed to strike entire families at once, how it spread like wildfire through close contact, a chilling testament to its insidious nature. He mentioned the unpleasant smell that clung to the sick, a sharp, almost foul odor that no amount of washing seemed to remove, a detail that echoed my own subtle, unpleasant observations. We worked together, the scent of turned earth and honest labor clinging to his hands, a grounding presence against the prevailing fear. He offered a small, encouraging smile, a fleeting moment of shared purpose that felt like a lifeline. Later that afternoon, a traveling merchant, a man named Silas, found his cartwheel splintered on the rough track leading into Oakhaven. He had been desperate to pass through, eager to reach the northern markets with his wares, but his progress was halted. His forced stop provided a brief yet significant connection to the outside world. He spoke of similar sicknesses he had encountered in villages further south, confirming my growing dread that this was not a localized affliction, but a spreading blight. He recounted how physicians in larger towns had simply fled, abandoning their patients to whatever fate awaited them, a stark reminder of the fear that gripped many. Silas also mentioned a peculiar theory he had overheard in a bustling market town in the south, that the plague was carried by tiny, unseen creatures, too small for the human eye to detect. He dismissed it as idle speculation, the ramblings of fearful men, but the idea resonated with me. It offered a potential explanation for how the sickness seemed to leap from person to person, bypassing common sense and careful hygiene. His rough weave cloak brushed against me as he leaned in to speak. The brief contact, a jolt, a reminder of the wider world and its many unknown dangers, a world that suddenly felt very far away. The community was not yet ready to embrace the farmer's pragmatic approach or Silas's unsettling whispers. The elder, seeing the continued decline of the boy and the growing fear, doubled down on his own beliefs. He organized a village procession, a solemn affair where villagers carried icons and prayed aloud, their voices a low, mournful chant. I watched from a distance, the scent of burning pitch from the torches sharp in my nostrils, feeling a strange mixture of pity and frustration. Their rituals, though heartfelt, seemed to ignore the physical realities of the disease. A small, almost forgotten joke from my childhood surfaced, a memory of my grandfather telling me that sometimes even the best intentions could lead to a muddled outcome, a thought that brought a faint, wry smile to my lips. The farmer, Thomas, had also brought me a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a piece of folk art passed down through his family. For luck, he'd said, his eyes conveying a depth of understanding that words often failed to capture. This simple gesture, a token of shared hope in the face of overwhelming odds, was more comforting than any poultice. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, human connection and tradition could offer a different kind of healing. The smooth, worn wood felt warm in my palm, a tangible piece of resilience. I also learned of an unusual practice from a conversation overheard. Some villagers believed wearing brightly colored ribbons could ward off the ill humors, a quaint but harmless superstition. There is, of course, an ongoing debate among learned physicians of my time regarding the true cause of such widespread pestilences. Some theorize it is a celestial influence, while others, like Silas hinted at, suspect something more tangible yet invisible. The boy's labored breaths grew shallower. I sat with him, holding his small hand, my own fear a constant thrum beneath the surface. His mother, hollow-eyed, sat nearby, her grief a silent, suffocating presence. I had learned much in my short time here, not just about herbs, but about the desperate resilience of the human spirit. The boy's tiny, weakening grip in mine felt like a physical representation of the village's fading hope. The knowledge I'd gained felt both heavy and precious. The deep suspicion I had felt from the village elder in Oakhaven was a heavy weight, as was my own uncertainty about the illness that was slowly creeping through the cottages. My initial attempts to help had been met with distrust, and the memory of the boy I couldn't save still pricked at my conscience, making my careful cataloging of herbs seem like a futile endeavor against such a potent, unseen enemy. This disquiet was amplified by the traveling merchant's unsettling tales, which confirmed my worst fears. This was not a localized ailment, but a plague spreading across the land, leaving devastation in its wake. The merchant's mention of tiny, unseen carriers of disease lodged itself in my mind, a strange and disquieting notion that offered a new, if terrifying, perspective on the sickness. Amidst this growing unease and the stark reality of my limitations, I found an unlikely and invaluable ally in a farmer named Thomas. His own grief over the recent loss of his wife to the sickness had not hardened into the same kind of suspicion I faced from others. Instead, it had forged a grim practicality in him. Thomas understood the desperate need for action, even when the path forward was shrouded in uncertainty, and he saw the suffering around him with a clear, unclouded eye. He readily offered his help, accompanying me into the fields and meadows to gather the herbs I needed, his deep knowledge of the local flora proving itself indispensable in identifying the most potent plants. Thomas's familiarity with the land allowed us to discover patches of potent comfrey and feverfew that I might otherwise have overlooked, and his quiet resilience in the face of his own loss was a source of strength. He also shared his own stark observations about the illness, noting how it seemed to strike entire families with a swiftness that defied rational explanation, and how it spread with alarming rapidity through close contact. He spoke, too, of the unpleasant odor that seemed to cling to those afflicted by the sickness, a sharp, almost foul scent that no amount of washing or cleansing could seem to dispel, a detail that I meticulously recorded in my notes. We worked together under the open sky, the faint, comforting scent of turned earth rising from Thomas's hands as he handed me bundles of herbs. His pragmatic approach to our shared task was a welcome contrast to the fear and superstition that seemed to grip the rest of the village, and his willingness to engage with my methods, however rudimentary they might seem, gave me a much-needed sense of purpose. He was a man who saw the problem and sought to address it directly, without the elaborate rituals or the fearful pronouncements that so often hindered progress, and his grounded nature felt like an anchor in the swirling chaos of the epidemic. This collaboration provided a different kind of discovery for me, moving beyond the purely academic into the realm of shared experience and practical application. Thomas's insights, born from a life spent intimately with the land and now tempered by profound personal loss, offered a unique perspective that supplemented my own training. He pointed out how certain plants seem to thrive even in the shadow of the sickness, their resilience a quiet testament to nature's enduring power, and he shared local lore about their properties, some of which hinted at ancient wisdom regarding fevers and general weakness. He also spoke of how the sickness seemed to affect those who worked closely together, such as the weavers or the woodcutters, reinforcing the idea of contagion that the traveling merchant had also alluded to, though he described it in more natural terms, as if the very air itself carried the sickness like a whisper. This information, coupled with my own observations, began to paint a more complete picture of the disease's relentless spread, allowing me to develop a clearer, though no less terrifying, understanding of its patterns. The practical application of his knowledge alongside my own was building a foundation for a more nuanced approach to combating this unknown enemy. The shared work and conversation with Thomas offered a welcome respite from the pervasive gloom that had settled over Oakhaven, a brief period where the immediate needs of the present overshadowed the larger, more terrifying questions about the future. He treated me not as an outsider or a meddler, but as a fellow laborer against a common foe, and this acceptance, this shared humanity, was a powerful antidote to the isolation I had felt. His unwavering commitment to helping where he could, despite his own recent devastation, served as a potent reminder of the inherent strength within the human spirit, even when faced with overwhelming adversity. The farmer's pragmatic support also encouraged me to continue my own investigations more boldly, pushing beyond the limits of my known remedies. He helped me gather specific plants he remembered his mother using for lung ailments, and together we prepared stronger infusions. The sharp scent of horehound, a familiar, yet somehow more potent aroma in the small space I used as an infirmary. This collaborative effort felt like a true step forward, a practical application of our combined knowledge, and the shared purpose brought a renewed sense of hope, however fragile, that we might yet find a way to ease the suffering. As the days passed and the sickness continued its grim toll, Thomas's practical counsel became increasingly vital. His observations about the efficacy of isolation when it could be enforced proving particularly insightful. He noticed how families who voluntarily separated themselves from the rest of the village seemed to fare slightly better, a detail that further cemented my belief in the need for such measures. This understanding, forged through shared labor and open discussion, was a critical development in my approach, moving me away from generalized treatments towards more specific, albeit still experimental, interventions. The shared task of gathering herbs and preparing remedies with Thomas had been a grounding experience, a reminder that even in the face of such a devastating plague, community and practical knowledge could still offer a measure of solace and resistance. His insights, combined with my own efforts, provided a foundation for a more informed approach, highlighting the importance of careful observation and the combined strength of different forms of knowledge, a lesson that would serve me well in the dark days to come. This adventure had indeed changed how I saw the world around me. The sickness was no longer a distant rumor, but a ravenous beast that had truly sunk its claws into Oakhaven. The boy I had tried so desperately to save, whose fevered brow I had cooled with damp cloths, and whose swollen glands I had soothed with poultices, had finally succumbed. Seeing his small body still and lifeless, his breath stilled forever, sent a profound wave of despair washing over me, a bleakness that threatened to extinguish the last embers of my hope. After this, more cottages, once vibrant with the sounds of family life, were shuttered tight, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at the growing desolation. The familiar, cheerful chatter of daily village life had been replaced by the muffled sounds of weeping, a mournful chorus that seemed to weave itself into the very fabric of the air. Indeed, the communal burial ground, a peaceful place usually reserved for the quiet repose of elders, was becoming a site of constant, grim activity. The dull thud of shovels on earth, a sound I had previously associated with seasonal work, now served as a relentless, mournful rhythm to our days. It was during this period, as the shadow of death deepened over the village, that I began to notice an odd, faint metallic tang on my tongue, a peculiar sensation that I at first dismissed as a trick of my weary senses. However, as the days wore on, this strange taste became inextricably linked in my mind with the growing, palpable fear that permeated every interaction and every quiet moment. My initial academic curiosity, the detached interest that had spurred me from Bristol, had long since evaporated. replaced by a desperate, all-consuming need to understand this invisible enemy and, if possible, to somehow save lives. This shift in my own focus, from observation to active engagement, meant that my partnership with Thomas, the pragmatic farmer, had become even more vital. He understood the stark reality of our situation, his own recent loss fueling a quiet determination that mirrored my own growing resolve. He had a keen eye for the subtle signs of the sickness and an uncanny ability to sense which families were most vulnerable, his insights often proving more accurate than my own medical texts. We worked in tandem, his knowledge of the land complementing my understanding of herbs, and together we strove to identify and isolate the sick, a difficult task in a close-knit community where neighbors often felt compelled to care for one another. Thomas had pointed out how families living in closer proximity to the stagnant pond on the edge of the village seemed to sicken more rapidly than those whose homes were closer to the forest. This observation, combined with the merchant's vague mention of unseen carriers, spurred a new line of inquiry for me. I began to document which homes were closest to the water sources and the direction of the prevailing winds, noting whether the sickness seemed to spread with greater speed in that particular direction. Though I could not see any tangible cause, the patterns of transmission were becoming distressingly clear, suggesting a contagion that moved not just through touch, but perhaps through the very air we breathed, a terrifying thought that settled deep in my gut. Amidst the pervasive sense of loss and the growing dread, a fragile thread of humanity persisted in the form of a young orphan girl named Lily. Her parents had been among the first taken by the sickness, leaving her adrift in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly empty. She had, with a child's instinct for safety, sought refuge with me, her small hand clinging to mine with surprising strength, as if I were her only anchor in a sea of despair. I had taken her in, sharing the meager provisions I had brought from Bristol, and her innocent questions and her sheer need for comfort became a powerful reminder of why I had undertaken this daunting journey in the first place. Teaching Lily the simple tasks of grinding herbs, fetching water, and carefully following my instructions became a crucial part of my daily routine, a much-needed distraction from the grim realities surrounding us. Her presence, the feel of her small, warm hand tucked securely in mine as we moved through the quiet village, served as a gentle balm against the overwhelming emotional fatigue that threatened to consume me. We shared the simple taste of dry dates for sustenance, small, sweet moments of normalcy that felt like precious treasures in the midst of so much sorrow. This quiet companionship offered a flicker of warmth, a silent testament to the enduring nature of life, even when surrounded by death. The relentless march of the sickness forced me to become more daring in my remedies, pushing beyond the familiar boundaries of my knowledge. I began to experiment more boldly, combining herbs known for their fever-reducing properties with others believed to cleanse the blood and purify the humors. I also insisted on burning juniper branches in the homes of the sick, a practice I recalled my grandfather mentioning for its supposed ability to purge unhealthy air, and urged the villagers to boil their water, a simple precaution that was met with initial grumbling but eventually garnered grudging acceptance as the situation worsened. I had observed firsthand the effectiveness of isolation, noting how a small cluster of cases began to abate after I convinced a particularly fearful family to remain strictly within the confines of their cottage, allowing no one in or out. This was agonizing work, the sharp, pungent scent of burning herbs filling my small infirmary, a desperate, almost futile attempt to ward off the inevitable. My own body ached with a profound fatigue, the constant strain of sleepless nights and ceaseless worry, making each breath feel like a deliberate effort, a conscious act against the creeping exhaustion. A traveling merchant, his cart laden with goods, and his face etched with a desperate eagerness to pass through Oakhaven on his way north, was forced to halt his journey when his axle snapped on the rough village track. He brought with him tales of similar sicknesses plaguing other villages along his route, confirming my deepest fears that this was not an isolated tragedy confined to our small community, but part of a much larger, more terrifying wave of illness. He spoke of physicians in larger towns who had, in their fear, abandoned their patients, leaving them to the mercy of fate and the encroaching disease. Furthermore, this merchant mentioned a peculiar theory circulating in the southern lands, a notion that sounded almost like madness, but nevertheless resonated deeply with the way the sickness seemed to leap from person to person, defying any logical explanation. He spoke of the plague being carried by tiny creatures, so small they were utterly unseen by the naked eye, a concept that, while outlandish, seemed to align with the swift and insidious nature of the contagion we faced. His words, though unsettling, provided a new, if strange, angle for my observations, hinting at a cause far more complex than simple imbalances of the humors. The rough weave of his cloak brushed against my arm as he spoke, a brief, fleeting connection to the wider, perhaps equally afflicted, world beyond Oakhaven. It was then, in the midst of this deepening crisis, that Thomas, my steadfast farmer ally, fell ill. His usual strength, his quiet pragmatism, and his unwavering resolve, all were cruelly extinguished by the relentless march of the disease. I sat by his bedside, administering what comfort I could, my poultices and infusions offering no cure, only a small measure of relief from his suffering. His passing was a profound and devastating blow. I had come to rely on his quiet strength, his grounding presence, and his death felt like a deep, personal failure, a testament to the overwhelming power of this unseen enemy. The silence that followed his last labored breaths was more profound, more absolute than any I had yet experienced in the village. The memory of his gruff voice, the comforting smell of earth and honest labor that always clung to him, felt like a physical ache in my chest. I found myself wrestling with a powerful urge to flee, to abandon this dying village and the ghosts of its inhabitants, to seek my own safety and escape the overwhelming despair. The agonizing choice between my sworn duty to help and the primal instinct for self-preservation gnawed at me relentlessly. With the plague showing absolutely no sign of abating, my focus began to shift from the elusive quest for a cure to the more immediate and attainable goal of providing comfort and alleviating the suffering of those afflicted. I learned to manage the excruciating pain with tinctures of poppy, to meticulously clean and dress the weeping wounds, and to offer soothing drinks and words of hope, even when the outlook for recovery remained grim. I taught Lily how to prepare simple herbal teas and how to keep the sick comfortable and clean, tasks that required both gentleness and a steady hand. The acrid scent of sickness had become all too familiar, but I also learned to recognize the subtle, calming scents of chamomile and mint used to ease fevers, small victories in a landscape of defeat. My confidence was no longer rooted in the hope of conquering the disease outright, but in the quiet, determined act of easing its passage, of preserving what little dignity and humanity we could amidst the widespread devastation. The immense weight of all that I had witnessed, the sheer scale of the loss settled upon my shoulders, tempering my youthful eagerness with a deep, quiet resolve that felt both ancient and new. I carried this profound understanding of suffering with me as I continued on. The priest's study, usually filled with the comforting scent of old paper and beeswax from countless candles, now seemed to hold a palpable stillness. Father Michael sat across from me, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. He had sought me out, not for a cure, for what cure could possibly exist for this rampant sickness, but for answers I did not possess. His faith, the very bedrock of this village, was visibly cracking under the strain of so much death, so many prayers seemingly lost in the vastness of the heavens. He looked at me, his eyes reflecting a deep, weary confusion, and the question hung in the quiet room. Where is God in this, Ilara? This direct question struck a chord deep within me, echoing my own burgeoning professional crisis. I had arrived with my grandfather's worn medical texts, brimming with the confidence of learned remedies for fevers, coughs, and broken bones. Yet this illness, with its swift cruelty and the strange dark swellings it brought, defied every known balance of humors, every practiced poultice. My carefully catalogued herbs, my knowledge of cleansing fevers and drawing out poisons, felt woefully inadequate against this invisible enemy that swept through Oakhaven like a scythe through wheat. He continued, his voice low and strained, describing the growing despair he witnessed daily. The communal prayers, once a source of solace and unity, now often dissolved into weeping. He spoke of the faces of the bereaved, the hollow eyes that searched the sky for answers, for a sign that their suffering was not forgotten. This raw testament to human anguish, coming from the man who represented divine comfort, felt like a profound betrayal of everything I believed about my own calling. I found myself wrestling with the same gnawing doubt he expressed. Had I truly been prepared for this, or had my studies only equipped me for the more predictable ailments of the world, leaving me utterly defenseless against such a devastating, inexplicable plague? The very foundations of my understanding of healing felt threatened, and the thought of my own efforts being meaningless against this tide of death was a bitter taste on my tongue, even before I remembered the lingering metallic sensation that sometimes accompanied my own fatigue. He confessed that he too had begun to question the rituals, the sacraments, the promises of divine protection. How could they be reconciled with the sight of infants taken in the night, of strong men felled in their prime? His struggle wasn't one of defiance, but of a profound, aching bewilderment. It was a plea for understanding, a shared burden of incomprehension that bound us in that quiet, candlelit room despite our vastly different roles in the village. I remembered his diligence, the hours he spent tending to the spiritual needs of every soul in Oakhaven, regardless of their standing. He had been a constant presence, a steady hand offering blessings and comfort. Now that steady hand trembled as he spoke of his own fading certainty, and I realized that my perceived expertise offered no shield against the universal experience of fear and helplessness. This shared vulnerability, this open admission of doubt between the spiritual leader and the village healer, created an unexpected connection. It moved beyond the usual deference villagers showed to their priest or their visiting physician. Here, in the hushed confines of his study, we were simply two individuals grappling with a crisis that transcended our established roles, both seeking meaning in a world that seemed determined to strip it away. The harsh reality was that my learned remedies had proven ineffective against the boy's relentless fever and the dark swellings that marked his suffering. His death, along with so many others, weighed heavily on me, a constant reminder of the limitations of my knowledge. The elder's initial suspicion, though perhaps born of fear, now seemed to echo in the priest's own quiet despair. This conversation with Father Michael was a turning point, shifting my focus from solely seeking a physical cure to understanding the broader human experience of such a calamity. It highlighted how deeply intertwined faith, hope, and despair were in the face of overwhelming loss, and how my role, even in its limitations, could still offer a different kind of sustenance. The weight of his sorrow and my own professional doubt settled around me, not as an excuse for inaction, but as a catalyst for a deeper, more empathetic approach. We spoke for a long time, the silence between his words as significant as the words themselves, both of us lost in the immensity of the question he had posed, a question that seemed to hang in the very air of Oakhaven itself. He spoke of the communal prayers, the fervent appeals to heaven, and the agonizing silence that followed. Each unanswered plea chipped away at his conviction, leaving him feeling exposed and inadequate before his flock. It was a profound moment of shared human frailty, and it spurred within me a new, albeit somber, determination. My journey to Oakhaven, intended to document a new illness, had taken an unexpected turn toward confronting the limits of human understanding in the face of pervasive suffering. Amidst the pervasive death, I found a flicker of life in a young orphan girl named Lily. Her parents had been among the first taken, their absence a gaping wound in the small community that left her adrift and vulnerable. She clung to me, her small hand clutching mine with a surprising, desperate strength that spoke volumes of her fear and need for any anchor. I took her in, sharing my meager provisions, the dried dates tasting sweeter for the small act of sharing them with another soul. Her innocent questions, born from a child's unclouded perspective, and her simple need for comfort were a powerful reminder of why I had truly come to Oakhaven beyond the academic pursuit of documenting this illness. Teaching her to grind herbs, a task that required careful measure and steady hands, to fetch water from the well, or to simply follow instructions, became a vital part of my day, grounding me in the present. Her presence, the feel of her small, warm hand in mine as we walked, was a balm against the growing emotional fatigue that threatened to consume me. This shift in my focus offered a much-needed respite from the overwhelming despair that had settled over the village like a shroud. While the sickness continued its cruel work, this new responsibility, this nurturing of a young life, provided a different kind of purpose. I began to see the importance of small victories, of creating moments of normalcy in a world turned upside down, and Lily's laughter, though sometimes still tinged with sadness, was a sound that pushed back the encroaching darkness. The shared simplicity of our meals, often just dried fruit and the occasional hard biscuit, became a ritual that grounded us both. The elder, Father Michael, had spoken of faith being tested, and I understood his words more keenly now. My own reliance on observation and learned remedies felt insufficient. Yet holding Lily's hand, preparing her a warm drink, these were actions I could control, things that brought a measure of peace. I recalled a scholarly debate I had once overheard in Bristol about the role of the healer, not just in curing, but in comforting the afflicted, a concept I had dismissed as a secondary concern. Now it felt like the very heart of the matter. One afternoon, while preparing a mild tonic for Lily, I discovered that a particular wildflower, one I had previously cataloged as merely ornamental with no medicinal value, seemed to have a calming effect when brewed into a tea. It was a small, almost insignificant find, but it offered a glimmer of something new. The stamens of the flower, when crushed between my fingers, released a faint, sweet aroma unlike any other I had encountered in my herb gathering. This unexpected discovery reminded me that even in the darkest times, nature often held hidden answers waiting to be found. We discovered that a small amount of this wild bloom, steeped in warm water, seemed to quiet Lily's occasional anxious tremors and even helped her sleep more soundly. It was a far cry from a cure for the plague, but its effect on her small frame was noticeable, a gentle easing of her distress. This practical application of my growing knowledge, however minor, provided a sense of accomplishment, a small bulwark against the overwhelming tide of loss and helplessness. The delicate texture of the petals felt soft against my fingertips. The historical accounts I had studied mentioned that during times of widespread illness, people often turned to comfort in familiar rituals and traditions. I found this to be true as I observed the villagers, those who remained, finding solace in shared prayers and communal songs, even as the fear remained palpable. It was a collective effort to maintain a sense of shared humanity and resilience, a quiet defiance against the isolating nature of the sickness. The faint smell of wood smoke from the village hearths, a comforting, familiar scent, seemed to anchor these moments. A quirky detail I noticed was that the normally boisterous village dogs had become unusually quiet, often seen lying near the doors of the afflicted cottages, as if sensing the suffering within. This unusual behavior, this silent vigil, struck me as poignant, a natural world mirroring the human tragedy unfolding around it. It was a stark reminder of the interconnectedness of all living things, and how even the smallest creatures seemed to feel the weight of the illness's presence. The rough texture of the dog's fur when one nudged my hand for comfort was a grounding sensation. I also learned that the practice of isolating the sick, while effective, had unintended consequences, tearing at the social fabric of Oakhaven. Families were split, and the communal spirit that had once defined the village was strained to its breaking point. This separation, while medically necessary, created a profound sense of loneliness for those afflicted, amplifying their fear and despair. The taste of plain boiled water, our only shared refreshment during these difficult discussions, felt stark against the backdrop of such deep human need. The implications of these societal shifts would unfold in time. The sickness continued its relentless march through Oakhaven, each day bringing news of new sufferers and deeper shadows in the villagers' eyes. My own reserves of strength felt tested, yet the escalating crisis compelled me to experiment more boldly with the herbs and poultices at my disposal. I began combining familiar fever-reducing plants like meadowsweet and willowbark with others I had read about, believed to cleanse the blood, such as burdock root and sorrel. This careful yet urgent work filled my small infirmary with the sharp, pungent scent of crushed leaves and roots, a desperate attempt to create a bulwark against the inevitable tide of illness. My hands, often stained with plant juices, moved with a practiced urgency, but the sheer volume of need meant my efforts felt like drops in a vast, uncaring ocean. During this time, I insisted on a practice that seemed peculiar to some, burning juniper branches in afflicted homes. The smoke, acrid and biting, filled the rooms, and I urged the villagers to open windows and doors afterward, hoping to drive out the unhealthy air. This method, while difficult to endure and often leaving my own throat raw, was a physical manifestation of my determination to confront the invisible enemy. I also began urging everyone to boil their water, a practice met with considerable grumbling. Many saw it as an unnecessary fuss, clinging to their habit of drawing directly from the well, but I saw firsthand how families who adopted this precaution seemed to fare slightly better, a small victory in a war of attrition. This period also brought a stark illustration of the effectiveness of isolation. A small cluster of cases had begun to abate in the western part of the village only after I managed to convince an entire family to remain strictly confined to their cottage. Their fear, coupled with my earnest pleas, had finally persuaded them to forego the communal gatherings that had become so precious in the face of despair. Watching their recovery, however slow, provided a glimmer of hope, even as the constant strain of my work left my own body aching with fatigue. Each breath felt like an effort, a testament to the toll the constant worry and exertion were taking. Meanwhile, the arrival of a traveling merchant brought unsettling news from beyond Oakhaven's quiet borders. His cart had broken down nearby, forcing him to stop, and he was desperate to pass through on his way north. He carried with him tales of similar sicknesses that had taken hold in other villages along his route, confirming my growing fear that this was not a localized affliction, but a widespread calamity. He spoke of physicians in larger towns who had, in their fear, abandoned their patients, leaving them to face the plague alone, a chilling thought that resonated with the pervasive sense of helplessness. Furthermore, the merchant shared a theory circulating in the southern regions, a concept that sounded like pure fancy but held a disturbing logic. He spoke of physicians who believed the plague was carried by tiny creatures, unseen by the eye, a notion that aligned uncomfortably with how the sickness seemed to leap from person to person with terrifying speed, defying all my current understandings of bodily humors. His words, though unsettling and bordering on the fantastical, offered a new, if grim, avenue for my observations, suggesting that perhaps the very air and touch I was so focused on were not the only pathways for this invisible killer. This encounter with the merchant also highlighted the stark differences in how such a crisis was being met across the land, contrasting Oakhaven's hesitant adoption of my methods with the flight of more established healers elsewhere. His brief presence, the rough weave of his wool cloak brushing against me as he spoke of distant towns, served as a stark reminder of the world beyond our immediate struggle, a world that seemed both indifferent and perhaps just as afraid. The taste of the stale bread he offered me was dry, a stark contrast to the fresh loaves I had smelled upon my arrival, mirroring the changing atmosphere of the village. In the midst of these efforts, I found myself grappling with the deep societal impact the disease was having on the very fabric of village life. Communal meals, once a cornerstone of Oakhaven's social cohesion, were becoming rare, replaced by solitary meals within shuttered homes, a necessary precaution that nonetheless felt like a profound loss. The elders' usual stories and guidance sessions, vital for passing down wisdom, were curtailed as fear of contagion kept people apart. It felt as though the threads that bound the community together were fraying, one by one, under the relentless pressure of the sickness. The farmer, Thomas, whose quiet pragmatism had been such a comfort, was taken ill during this period. His strength, his willingness to help gather herbs, his grounded nature, all of it was extinguished by the relentless disease. I sat by his bedside, administering what comfort I could with my tinctures, but my remedies offered no cure, only a small measure of relief from his labored breathing. His passing was a profound blow, a personal failure that struck at the very core of my purpose. The silence that followed his labored breaths was more profound than any I had yet experienced, and the memory of his rough hands and the smell of honest labor clung to me like a shroud. His death left me wrestling with a powerful urge to flee, to abandon this dying village and seek my own safety. The choice between my commitment to the villagers and the primal instinct for self-preservation gnawed at me, a constant internal conflict that made sleep an elusive luxury. The raw, earthy smell of the packed earth beneath my feet felt like a grounding force, reminding me of Thomas and the life he represented. But the overwhelming sense of futility threatened to pull me under. Yet, even in my despair, the memory of the orphan girl, Lily, and her quiet strength kept a small ember of resolve glowing within me. As the days bled into weeks and the sickness showed no signs of abating, my focus began to shift from the elusive quest for a cure to the more immediate and attainable goal of providing comfort and alleviating suffering. I learned to manage the pain of the afflicted with tinctures of poppy, a practice I was hesitant to embrace at first, but one that brought a measure of peace to those in agony. I focused on cleaning and dressing wounds, offering soothing drinks, and speaking words of hope even when the outlook was undeniably grim. My role was evolving, and with it, my understanding of what it truly meant to heal. I continued to teach Lily, showing her how to prepare simple herbal teas and how to keep the sick comfortable, her small hands surprisingly steady as she assisted me. The acrid scent of sickness became a familiar, though unwelcome, presence in my life, but I also learned to recognize the subtle, calming scent of chamomile and mint, herbs that offered a gentle respite from fevers and troubled stomachs. My confidence was no longer rooted in the belief that I could conquer this disease, but in the quiet strength found in easing its passage, in holding on to what little humanity and dignity we could preserve amidst the devastating onslaught. My understanding of facing overwhelming illness had shifted in ways I hadn't expected. A traveling merchant, his cart lath-bound and laden with goods I could only guess at, was forced to halt his journey just outside Oakhaven. His axle had splintered, a common enough mishap on these rough roads, but his desperation to pass through our village felt palpable. He spoke of similar sicknesses he had encountered in hamlets further north, a grim confirmation of my deepest fears that this plague was not confined to our valley. He mentioned physicians in larger towns, men I had perhaps read about in my grandfather's texts, who had apparently abandoned their posts and their patients, leaving them to face the illness alone. The merchant's words, though tinged with the fear of a man trying to outrun a shadow, offered a different perspective on the wider impact of this dreadful ailment. The man then shared a story, a rumor he'd picked up in a southern market, about the plague being carried by tiny creatures, things too small to be seen with the naked eye. It sounded like the wild imaginings of a frightened mind, yet the concept resonated with the way the sickness seemed to jump between people, appearing in one household and then the next with an unnerving speed. He said these whispers spoke of needing to cleanse the very air, not just with fire and herbs, but by understanding these invisible carriers. His tales, while unsettling, provided a new angle for my own observations, a different lens through which to view the invisible enemy we faced. I recall the rough weave of his cloak brushing against my arm as he leaned closer to impart this strange theory, a fleeting but significant connection to the world beyond Oakhaven's present troubles. As I listened, I noticed the merchant constantly wiping his brow, his skin glistening despite the gentle breeze that stirred the leaves overhead. He seemed to carry a perpetual discomfort, a restlessness that spoke of a fear of lingering too long in any one place. He offered me some dried figs, their sweetness a welcome change from the constant worry that had settled in my own mouth. It was a small gesture, a brief moment of shared humanity amidst his haste and my own anxieties, and I felt a strange kinship with this man, who was, like me, merely trying to navigate a world suddenly made uncertain and perilous. This encounter reinforced for me the scale of the affliction, moving it from a localized tragedy to a widespread disaster that was sweeping across the land like a wildfire. The merchant's stories of abandoned villages and fleeing healers painted a stark picture of the societal breakdown this pestilence could cause, and I felt a fresh wave of dread for my own small community. My own efforts, which had felt so vital and focused just days before, now seemed like trying to hold back a tidal wave with a sieve. The sheer immensity of the problem, described by a man who had seen its tendrils creeping across the country, made my task feel both more urgent and impossibly daunting. I spent some time observing the merchant as he worked to repair his cart, his movements surprisingly efficient despite his evident unease. He worked with a quiet focus, the rhythmic rasp of his tools a steady sound against the murmur of the nearby stream. It struck me how even in the face of such widespread illness, the basic necessities of life, trade, travel, the mending of broken things, continued. It was a small, almost defiant act of normalcy in a world that felt anything but normal. He even managed a wry comment about the unreliability of axles, a brief flash of humor that, while startling, felt oddly grounding. Later that day, I observed how the village children, who had been playing near the stream, suddenly became more subdued. They huddled closer together, their games replaced by hushed whispers, as if they too had sensed the amplified fear carried by the merchant's words. It was a subtle shift, yet deeply noticeable to me, a reminder of how the unseen currents of dread could permeate even the most innocent of lives. The usual bright, clear calls of the kingfishers that frequented the water's edge seemed more distant, their presence less bold than before. The merchant, having finally mended his axle, prepared to depart. He offered a final, heartfelt warning to stay cautious, his eyes scanning the village as if searching for hidden dangers. He did not linger, eager to put more miles between himself and Oakhaven, and I understood his haste. As he drove away, his cart rattling over the uneven ground, I watched him go, a solitary figure receding into the distance. The encounter left me with a mix of apprehension and a strange sort of reassurance. The world was indeed suffering, but it was also still moving, still trying to carry on, and I was not the only one grappling with these new and terrible realities. This meeting with the merchant also prompted a deeper consideration of the theories he had shared. The idea of invisible agents of disease, though alien to my current understanding, began to stir something within me, a professional curiosity that even the pervasive fear could not entirely extinguish. It was a question that would require a new kind of observation, a turning inward to consider possibilities that lay beyond the tangible and the easily explained. I felt a sense of responsibility to try and understand this, not just for myself, but for the people of Oakhaven who depended on my efforts, however limited they might prove to be. The challenges I faced were indeed testing me in ways I was only beginning to grasp. Thomas, my farmer ally, was taken ill with a sudden, fierce fever that left him weakened and gasping. His strength, his pragmatism, his quiet grief over the loss of his wife, all were being extinguished by this relentless disease. I sat by his bedside in his simple cottage, the familiar scent of dried herbs and wood smoke now tinged with something heavier, something sadder. I administered what comfort I could, a willow bark infusion to ease his pain, cool cloths to his brow. But my remedies offered no cure, only a lessening of his suffering, and even that felt like a poor imitation of relief. His passing was a profound blow, a personal failure that settled heavily upon me, a weight heavier than any satchel of herbs I had ever carried. I had begun to rely on his quiet strength, his grounding presence in the midst of so much chaos, and his death felt like a testament to my own inadequacy. The silence that followed his labored breaths was more profound than any I had yet experienced, a void where his steady breathing had been. The memory of his gruff voice, the smell of earth and honest labor that clung to him, now felt like a physical ache deep within me, a constant reminder of what had been lost. The community's response, seeing another respected villager taken, shifted from passive observation to a more active, though desperate, seeking of solutions. Without Thomas to guide me through the fields, my own exploration for potent herbs became more solitary, my focus sharpened by a growing fear for myself and for the remaining villagers. I found myself wrestling with a primal urge to flee, to abandon this dying village to its fate, and save myself from the encroaching shadow of sickness. The choice between my duty as a healer and the powerful instinct for self-preservation gnawed at me, a constant, unsettling companion. This internal struggle made my work feel more fragile, my once certain steps now faltering with doubt. I observed how the surviving villagers began to cling more fiercely to familiar routines, almost as a way to push back against the unfamiliar terror that had descended upon them. Some resumed their labor in the fields with a renewed, almost frantic energy, as if sheer busyness could ward off the invisible threat. Others gathered more frequently at the village cross, their hushed conversations a stark contrast to the usual lively discussions, seeking comfort in shared anxiety. The communal impact of this new wave of sickness was becoming starkly evident in ways beyond just the empty cottages. The usual pattern of communal meals, a vital part of village life where neighbors shared food and news, began to break down. Those who were well seemed hesitant to gather, a subtle but profound shift that altered the very fabric of social connection. This isolation, I realized, was as much a symptom of the illness as any physical swelling, a fracturing of the bonds that held their community together. In the absence of Thomas's practical guidance, I returned to my grandfather's teachings, his worn leather-bound texts now seeming like lifelines in a sea of despair. I pored over descriptions of past ailments, searching for any hint, any parallel that might offer a clue to this new pestilence. The smell of old parchment and dried ink filled my small makeshift infirmary, a comforting aroma that grounded me amidst the unsettling scent of illness that permeated the air. His careful notations on the properties of herbs and the humors of the body provided a framework for my observations, a method for understanding even when direct cures eluded me. The remaining villagers, witnessing the escalating losses, began to exhibit a different kind of resilience, one born from necessity rather than from a naive belief in invulnerability. They started sharing what little they had with more urgency, a stark contrast to the earlier suspicions I had faced. A woman whose entire family had been spared offered me a portion of her dwindling flour, her eyes holding a quiet understanding of shared vulnerability. This act of kindness, offered amidst so much suffering, was a potent reminder of the deep wellspring of human compassion that could persist even in the darkest of times. As I continued to tend to the afflicted, I found myself focusing less on the grand act of finding a cure and more on the immediate, vital task of alleviating suffering. My efforts turned towards managing the pain with tinctures of poppy, carefully preparing them to offer a few moments of ease. I learned to clean and dress wounds with what little clean linen remained, striving to provide comfort and a sense of dignity in their final moments. The acrid scent of sickness was now a familiar, almost constant presence. But I also learned to recognize the subtle, calming scent of chamomile and mint that I used to ease fevers and thirst. My professional perspective had been irrevocably altered, tempered by the brutal realities I had witnessed. My youthful eagerness to conquer disease had been replaced by a deep, quiet resolve, an understanding that healing was not always about victory, but about offering solace, about holding on to what little humanity we could amidst the devastation. The weight of what I had witnessed, the faces of those I could not save, settled upon me, a profound and humbling lesson in the limits of my knowledge and the enduring power of empathy. The collective memory of this time, I sensed, would not be of scientific breakthroughs, but of shared endurance. The ways in which they supported each other, in small gestures and quiet acts of courage, would likely become the defining stories of Oakhaven survival. It was not the absence of illness that would be remembered, but the presence of kindness in the face of overwhelming fear, the way they continued to care for one another even as the shadow lengthened. This shift in my own understanding, this move from seeking a magical remedy to providing basic care and comfort, felt like a significant progression in my own journey. It was a humbling realization that sometimes the greatest service one can offer is simply to be present, to bear witness to suffering, and to offer what small measure of peace is possible. The very air of Oakhaven seemed to carry the echoes of these shared experiences, a testament to the spirit of those who persevered. My attention then turned to the practical needs of the survivors, understanding that recovery was a long road. I began to teach Lily, the orphan girl who had so bravely clung to me, how to prepare simple herbal teas and how to keep the sick comfortable, imparting the skills I had learned through harsh experience. Her small hands, though still unsteady, were eager to learn, and in teaching her, I felt a renewal of purpose, a sense of continuity for the knowledge I had gained. The shared experience of learning, of building something new from the ashes of loss, offered a fragile but welcome hope. The stark reality of Thomas's death and the ongoing losses reminded me that while some might flee, others were compelled to remain, to offer whatever solace they could. This encounter with profound personal loss lingered in my thoughts, shaping my resolve. The relentless march of the sickness had reshaped my purpose, turning me from a seeker of cures to a provider of solace. My focus shifted from the grand ambition of vanquishing this unseen enemy to the more immediate, yet equally vital, task of easing suffering where I could. This meant delving deeper into the practicalities of care, learning to manage the gnawing pain that afflicted so many with potent tinctures of poppy, a bitter-tasting but effective medicine. I found that simple acts, like carefully cleaning and dressing the angry swellings that bloomed on the skin, brought a measure of relief, a small victory against the overwhelming tide of disease. Even offering a soothing drink of diluted honey and water, accompanied by quiet words of hope, became a significant part of my efforts. Teaching Lily, the orphan girl who had found refuge with me, became a cornerstone of my days, a testament to the enduring need for continuity and purpose amidst chaos. She learned with a surprising quickness, her small hands carefully grinding herbs under my supervision, her trips to fetch water becoming more assured each day. We prepared simple herbal teas together, often a blend of chamomile and mint, their subtle, calming scents a pleasant contrast to the prevailing acrid odor that seemed to cling to everything. These shared moments, the quiet rhythm of our preparations, offered a fragile bubble of normalcy in the village's darkening world, reminding me that life, however diminished, still persisted. The weight of what I had witnessed and endured began to settle upon me. a heavy mantle that tempered my youthful eagerness. I saw how the disease stripped away not only physical strength, but also the very fabric of community life. Familiar rituals, like the communal meals and evening gatherings that had once bound Oakhaven together, had ceased entirely. The fear of contagion was so profound that even the most basic human connections became fraught with danger. Neighbors kept to their homes, and the sounds of weeping from isolated cottages replaced the usual friendly calls across the lanes. It was a stark lesson in how quickly social bonds could fray under extreme pressure. My own understanding of healing, I realized, had to adapt. While the quest for a cure remained a distant, almost unattainable goal, the immediate need was to make the dying more bearable and the survivors more resilient. I began to compile notes on which remedies seemed to offer the most relief from specific symptoms, recognizing that cure was a word too grand for my current capabilities. For instance, I observed that a mixture of willow bark and vervain, when brewed into a strong tea, often helped to quiet the feverish tremors that shook the afflicted, allowing for brief periods of rest. These small empirical discoveries felt significant in the face of such widespread devastation. There was also a peculiar aspect to the illness that puzzled me deeply. I noticed that those who worked with their hands, tending to the fields or mending tools, often seemed to recover more swiftly, or at least resist the worst symptoms, than those whose lives were more sedentary. A farmer who had been particularly active in the fields even as his family members grew ill surprised me by showing signs of recovery when his wife, who had remained indoors, had not. This observation, though anecdotal, led me to consider the role of physical exertion and perhaps even the different exposures to the elements that these varied lifestyles entailed. It was a detail I carefully recorded, hoping to discern a pattern. The village elder, who had initially viewed me with such suspicion, now approached me with a quiet desperation, his stern facade softened by the shared grief that had descended upon Oakhaven. He no longer questioned my methods, but instead asked for my opinion on the village's supply of grain. With many of the able-bodied gone or too ill to work, the remaining harvest was becoming a critical concern. This pragmatic worry, focused on sustenance and the future, was a welcome shift from the earlier anxieties and fears, and I offered what advice I could regarding rationing and storage, recognizing the fundamental importance of food in any community's survival. During this period, I found myself reflecting on the advice my grandfather had given me when I first left home. He had spoken of the importance of observation, of looking beyond the obvious symptoms to the underlying causes, even when those causes were invisible to the eye. His words echoed in my mind as I tended to the sick. He had also emphasized the value of communal support, stating that a village's strength lay not just in its resources, but in its unity. This idea of unity, however, seemed a distant memory in Oakhaven, where fear had driven many into isolation, and I wondered how I might help foster even the smallest semblance of connection again. A moment of genuine, albeit somber, arose when I was preparing a particularly pungent herbal poultice. Lily, watching me with wide eyes, asked if it smelled like old socks that had been left out in the rain. The comparison, while not entirely inaccurate, brought a faint smile to my lips, and I couldn't help but chuckle. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, the innocence and keen observations of children could offer moments of levity, breaking through the oppressive gloom. This was a precious commodity, and I treasured it, much like finding a rare bloom in a barren field. The historical context of our situation was becoming clearer to me. Accounts from travelers and merchants I had encountered spoke of similar afflictions spreading through other regions, though the descriptions varied. Some believed it was a pestilence sent by God, while others whispered of poisoned wells or the influence of celestial bodies. One particular theory, often debated among scholars of natural philosophy, suggested that the illness was carried by tiny, unseen seeds or agents that could travel through the air or on contaminated objects. This idea, though fanciful to some, aligned with my own observations of how quickly the sickness seemed to spread through households and close contact. My own professional development was undergoing a profound transformation. I was learning that healing was not always about immediate eradication of disease, but often about managing its progression, about preserving dignity and comfort when a cure was impossible. This shift required a different kind of expertise, one that combined empirical observation with a deep well of empathy. I found myself relying less on the complex formulas in my grandfather's books and more on the intuitive understanding that came from spending hours at the bedside, listening to the breathing, observing the subtle changes in the skin, and sensing the fear in the eyes of those who were suffering. There was a scholarly debate even then about the most effective method of preventing the spread of such ailments. Some advocated for strict isolation, a practice that seemed to align with the unseen seeds theory, while others believed in the power of certain herbs and fumigations to cleanse the air and ward off ill humors. My own experiences in Oakhaven suggested that a combination of approaches was likely most effective, with isolation proving crucial for containing outbreaks within families, and the burning of juniper or rosemary offering a psychological and perhaps subtle physical benefit to those who remained in the affected areas. The days were long, filled with a quiet, methodical work that demanded constant attention and a steady hand. I would prepare infusions, grind herbs for poultices, and change bandages, all while Lily assisted me, her small presence a constant source of comfort. We learned together, and in that shared learning there was a quiet strength. I noticed that the particular scent of lavender, which I had begun using to help calm the fevered, seemed to bring a measure of peace, a gentle respite from the anxiety that permeated the village. It was a small thing, perhaps, but in times of such widespread suffering, these small comforts became deeply significant. The knowledge I was gathering was hard-won, forged in the crucible of loss and uncertainty. It was a different kind of learning than I had ever imagined, one that demanded not just intellectual understanding, but a profound emotional resilience. The weight of responsibility for Lily, for the few remaining villagers who still sought my aid, settled upon my shoulders, shaping me in ways I had not anticipated. My initial excitement at documenting a new disease had long since faded, replaced by a quiet determination to do whatever good I could, however small, in the face of such immense hardship. I had witnessed something that would stay with me, a testament to the enduring human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. The sickness eventually receded, leaving Oakhaven a quieter, more subdued place. Many homes that had once bustled with life now stood empty, their shutters drawn against the world. The communal burial ground, a place usually marked by a gentle stillness, had become a stark, ever-present monument to the many lives tragically lost. My time here had not yielded a miraculous cure, no single simple answer to the devastating plague that had swept through the valley, but it had been a time of profound learning. I had observed closely, I had experimented with the knowledge I possessed, and in my own small way, I had offered solace to those who remained. My understanding of healing, therefore, had deepened significantly, now encompassing not only the physical body, but also the human spirit, which proved just as vulnerable to the ravages of disease and despair. As I prepared to leave, the taste of salt on my lips was not merely from the lingering sea air that sometimes drifted inland, but also from the countless tears shed for the fallen, a reminder of the many battles fought and, sadly, lost during my stay. Yet, mingled with that sorrow was the distinct tang of survival, a hard-won victory for those who endured. I carried with me not just meticulous notes on this new, terrifying ailment, but also the profound, difficult lessons learned about human resilience and the enduring, unwavering strength found in compassion. The road back to Bristol, which I had traveled with a sense of academic purpose, would now be a different journey entirely, marked by the quiet, indelible echoes of Oakhaven and its ordeal. This personal odyssey had redefined the very meaning of my profession. Even after the worst of the sickness had passed, a palpable quiet settled over Oakhaven, a silence born not of peace but of absence. The vibrant chatter that once echoed through the lanes was now a memory, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant cry of a hawk. I walked through the village, my footsteps unusually loud on the packed earth, observing the shuttered homes, each one a silent testament to lives extinguished. These were not just buildings, they were empty vessels that had once held laughter, stories, and the warmth of human connection. The communal burial ground, a place I had visited far too often, seemed to expand with each passing day. Its mounds of fresh earth were a constant, somber reminder of the invisible enemy that had swept through, leaving behind a landscape of grief. I had not found the single herb, the specific poultice that could banish this sickness, but I had learned to manage its terrible symptoms, to ease suffering where I could not prevent death. This pragmatic approach, born of necessity, felt like a small victory in itself. My medical satchel, once filled with the optimistic hope of discovery, now felt weighted with the heavy burden of experience. Each dried herb, each carefully written note represented a moment of struggle, a battle fought against an unknown foe. I had seen the fear in people's eyes, the desperate hope they placed in my hands, and the crushing disappointment when my efforts proved insufficient. This knowledge, though painful, was invaluable, shaping my understanding of medicine in ways no book could ever teach. While the immediate crisis had subsided, the long-term impact of the plague was evident in every aspect of village life. The fields that had been carefully tended now showed signs of neglect, and the communal spirit, though resilient, was clearly strained. I observed how traditions had shifted. A simple wedding feast was replaced by a quiet blessing, and the harvest festival, a time of communal celebration, was a subdued affair, marked by solemn remembrance rather than joyous revelry. These changes in daily ritual were more than just social adjustments. They were the deeply felt adaptations of a community tested by an overwhelming force. The shared experience of loss had, in a strange way, forged a new kind of bond among the survivors. They looked at each other with a deeper understanding, a shared recognition of what they had endured together. This collective resilience, though born of immense hardship, was a testament to the enduring human spirit. I spent my final days tending to the lingering coughs and weakness that followed the initial fever, offering nourishing broths and rest. I taught young Lily, the orphan girl who had become my shadow, how to prepare simple herbal teas, her small hands carefully crushing chamomile for its calming properties. Her innocence, her ability to find joy in small things, was a powerful source of comfort, not just for her, but for me as well. Her presence was a gentle counterpoint to the grim realities I had witnessed. She represented a future, a continuation of life in a place that had become intimately familiar with death. Her questions, though simple, often led me to reflect on the broader implications of this devastating disease. How did such unseen forces travel? What wisdom did the natural world hold that had eluded my formal learning? As I packed my satchel, I paused by the well, the same well from which I had drawn water on my arrival, a time that felt like a lifetime ago. The water still tasted clean and cool, a constant in a world that had been irrevocably altered. The familiar scent of wood smoke still curled from chimneys, but it was now layered with the memory of the unpleasant odor that had once permeated the village, a phantom reminder of the sickness. The contrast between my arrival and my departure was stark. I had come seeking knowledge, armed with academic training and a youthful confidence. I was leaving with a deeper, more somber understanding of life and death, of the limits of human intervention, and the profound importance of simple acts of kindness. The rough texture of the woven sack I used for my herbs felt different now, imbued with the weight of my experiences. The villagers, those who remained, offered quiet nods of farewell, their gratitude unspoken but deeply felt. There were no grand pronouncements, no elaborate ceremonies, only the shared understanding of what we had all been through. The elder, his stern demeanor softened by loss, even offered a rare, gruff word of thanks, a gesture that meant more to me than any formal praise. My journey back would be one of reflection. I carried with me not only the empirical data of a devastating plague, but also the immeasurable weight of human stories, the whispers of fear, the echoes of sorrow, and the quiet resilience of the human heart. The insights gained from my meticulous observations and the practical application of my skills had led me to this unexpected moment of profound understanding. As we close our eyes on the village's enduring spirit through the trials of the medieval plague, let the whispers of their resilience lull you into a deep slumber. Remember the hushed rumors that first crept through the cobblestone streets, the quiet dread that accompanied the first cases, and the brave, often desperate, community response. Imagine the empty cottages, the heavy hearts of those who remained, yet also the steadfast courage that carried them through. Daily lives, once vibrant with song and familiar rituals, transformed, but even in the shadow of immense loss, flickers of hope stubbornly returned. The shared grief, the quiet strength in facing the unknown, and the slow, gentle reemergence of life are echoes we carry with us. Let these stories, woven into the fabric of history, bring you peace. May your dreams be as gentle as the dawn that eventually broke over that enduring village. Sleep soundly.